Carlos Alcaraz found himself slumped in a dimly lit corner of a bustling cafe in Melbourne, the kind of spot where people chatter mindlessly about weather or sports while life's big questions eat away at you. The constant hum of voices and the clinking of cutlery around him felt miles away from the storm raging in his chest. Usually, his face radiated the kind of energy that could light up a dead room, the charm that had won him millions of fans. But tonight? His expression was as sour as the espresso cooling in his cup. Why? Because the damn TV across the cafe wouldn't stop replaying that moment. Jannik Sinner, grinning like he'd won the lottery, hoisting the Australian Open trophy high for the world to see. Alcaraz's jaw tightened. His phone buzzed on the table, vibrating with a relentless stream of notifications. Fans asking for his reaction, reporters sniffing around for a quote, and the inevitable wave of comparisons between him and Sinner. He ignored it all, gripping his cup with the kind of intensity that made you wonder if he was about to crush it in his hand. Later that night, holed up with his closest friends and team, he finally let the frustration boil over. "I just don't fucking get it," he started, pacing the room like a tiger in a too-small cage. "He's always been this quiet guy, you know? The I'm just here to play my game type. And now he's strutting around like he owns the bloody tour. Did you see him in the semis? The way he celebrated? Who does he think he is?" His coach tried to chime in, but Alcaraz waved him off like a fly. No, let me finish. This isn't just about tennis, okay? Sure, he played well, but his attitude. It's like he's suddenly this big shot. Where's all that humility he used to preach about? It feels fake as hell. The conversation shifted to Sinner's post-match comments, which clearly hit a nerve. The guy had thanked his team, gone on about his journey to the title. Standard stuff, but then he'd slipped in a line about needing to believe in one's own superiority on the court. To Alcaraz, it was a not-so-subtle dig. Believing in your superiority? "Give me a fucking break," he muttered, shaking his head. That's just his way of saying he thinks he's better than everyone else now. The online world wasn't helping. Clips of Sinner's antics were going viral. Dancing with fans, cheekily mimicking other players' signature moves, even winking at the camera during the trophy presentation. The internet loved it, calling him charming and playful. Alcaraz? He saw it differently. It's like he's rubbing it in everyone's face. There's a line between celebrating and being a cocky prick, and he sprinted right over it. The next day, Alcaraz had to face the press during a charity event. He started off diplomatic, congratulating Sinner and praising his performance. But when the questions kept coming, the mask started to slip. "Look, Jannik played well, no doubt about it. But tennis is more than just one tournament," he said, his tone growing sharper. "It's about consistency, respect for the sport, and how you carry yourself off the court. I hope he remembers that." The subtle jab was anything but subtle, and the media pounced on it like sharks smelling blood. By the next morning, headlines screamed across every sports page. Alcaraz questions Sinner's attitude, and rivalry heats up as Alcaraz criticizes Sinner. Social media exploded, splitting into camps. Some fans backed Alcaraz, saying he had a point about Sinner's sudden personality shift. Others called him out for being salty, pointing out he hadn't even made it to the final. In his hotel room that evening, Alcaraz scrolled through endless comments online, his name trending right alongside Sinner's. Fans dissected every word he'd said, some accusing him of being a sore loser, others defending him as a passionate competitor who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. One comment stopped him in his tracks. It was from a retired player, now a pundit, who wrote, "Alcaraz is young, fiery, and wears his heart on his sleeve. But he needs to channel that fire into his game, not into his words." He tossed his phone onto the bed, running a hand through his hair with a frustrated sigh. "Easier said than done," he muttered to himself, staring out the window at the city lights. Melbourne buzzed below him, oblivious to the inner chaos of a player who wasn't just battling his rivals, but also his own expectations. Rivalries are supposed to be built on mutual respect, not buried under a heap of bitterness and bruised egos. But damn, the word stung. Not because it wasn't true, no, that wasn't it, but because it hit too close to home. Carlos Alcaraz shut his laptop with a frustrated snap, the screen going black as if to mirror the chaos swirling in his mind. He couldn't shake it. No matter how hard he tried to drown himself in training, media obligations, or just plain denial, the thought of Jannik Sinner's transformation nagged at him like an itch he couldn't reach. Carlos kept replaying their earlier years, those simpler days when they were both just hungry up-and-comers trying to carve out their place in tennis history. Back then, there was camaraderie, mutual admiration, even as they tried to outdo one another. But now, it felt like Sinner was playing a whole new game, one that went far beyond the white lines of the court. The days that followed were a blur of practice drills, staged smiles for the cameras, and endless internal debates. He tried focusing on the next tournament, convincing himself that what mattered was the future, not the past. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, Sinner's shadow loomed large. He found himself obsessively watching footage of the Australian Open final, combing through every point, not just for tactical insights but to study him. Sinner. The smirks, the over-the-top celebrations, the interviews where every word felt like a carefully veiled flex. Was he overthinking it? Carlos wasn't sure. Was his frustration aimed at Sinner, or was it just his own disappointment taking on a different face? One evening, during a late-night practice session, he finally broke down and vented to his coach. "Maybe I'm just blowing this shit out of proportion," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I've worked my ass off to get here, you know? And now, it's like everyone's looking at him like he's the future of tennis. And me? I'm just the guy who couldn't even make the semis." His coach placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his tone calm but resolute. "Rivalries aren't supposed to be easy, Carlos. They're what push you to be better. This isn't a distraction. It's fuel. Use it. Show them all what you're made of." The advice made sense on paper, but deep down, the fire inside Carlos kept burning. He carried that flame onto the court, ready to prove that his name still held weight. But the doubts lingered, stubborn as hell. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, and his rivalry with Sinner? It was only just heating up. That night, long after his muscles ached from practice and the world had gone quiet, Carlos found himself back in the same cafe where this storm had first begun brewing. The place was almost empty now, save for a couple of late-night stragglers and the barista cleaning up for the night. Carlos sipped his coffee, staring at the dark liquid like it held the answers to life's biggest questions. His mind played a reel of every interaction he'd ever had with Sinner. Their matches, their locker room banter, even the polite nods exchanged at player meetings. Sinner had always been the quiet type. Painfully polite, almost to the point of being boring. It was part of what made him likable. The modesty, the hard work, the lack of ego. But now, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been an act. Was this new, cocky, almost arrogant Sinner the real deal? Or was he just hamming it up for the spotlight? Carlos caught himself tapping his fingers against the table, a nervous habit he hadn't even realized he'd picked up. The muted hum of the cafe only made the noise in his head louder. Grabbing his phone, he intended to mindlessly scroll through social media to distract himself, but the notifications hit him like a brick wall. His name and Sinner's were trending side by side, the debate online growing louder by the minute. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened a viral thread. It featured a side-by-side comparison. One clip of Carlos humbly praising an opponent after a tough loss, talking about learning from the experience. The other, Sinner's flamboyant, almost theatrical celebration after his victory. The caption read, "2 stars. 2 approaches. Which one do you respect more?" The comments were a war zone. Some praised Carlos for his sportsmanship and maturity. Others accused him of being jealous and bitter. "He's just salty because he didn't even make it to the semis," one comment read, complete with a laughing emoji. Another wrote, "Carlos is classy, sure, but let's be real. He can't stand not being the center of attention." Carlos dropped his phone onto the table and leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't who he wanted to be, the guy who let rivalries consume him, who second-guessed everything about his peers. But the feelings were raw, relentless. He'd always prided himself on being honest, both on and off the court. Now, that honesty was being twisted into bitterness for the world to pick apart. His mind wandered to the moments that had led him here, to this boiling point. It wasn't just Sinner's victory that gnawed at him. It was the way the narrative had shifted so abruptly. One win, and suddenly, Sinner was the golden boy, the new face of tennis. And Carlos? He was just another name in the draw. That fire inside him? It wasn't going out anytime soon. And maybe that was okay. Maybe, just maybe, it was what he needed to remind the world, and himself, why he belonged at the top. To the media, Carlos Alcaraz wasn't just a champion. He was the champion. The golden boy of tennis. The guy who had climbed the mountain, claimed his spot at the summit, and basked in the glow of the world's admiration. At least, that's how it used to feel. Now, that spotlight, once so blindingly bright, seemed dimmer, swallowed up by the roaring applause and endless praise being showered on Jannik Sinner. Carlos found himself replaying one particular moment from the tournament, a memory that, at the time, had seemed inconsequential but now carried a sharper, almost cutting weight. It was after Sinner's quarter-final victory. In the post-match interview, Sinner had casually mentioned how much he loved playing on the big stage, how he thrived under pressure. At first, it sounded like a throwaway comment, the kind of harmless soundbite athletes drop without much thought. But in hindsight, Carlos couldn't help but feel like it was a subtle dig, not just at him, but at everyone else who'd fallen short in this tournament. Was that a jab? He thought bitterly. And then there were the fans. During Sinner's matches, the crowd had been electric. The stadium practically shook with their chants and cheers, a deafening wave of support that Carlos hadn't heard for himself in a while. It gnawed at him, that feeling of being upstaged. He could almost hear the whispers in his own head. They love him. Maybe more than they love me. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth, one that even his third cup of coffee that night couldn't wash away. He hated feeling like this, jealous, bitter, insecure. It wasn't who he wanted to be, but damn, the truth was hard to ignore. Tennis wasn't just a physical game. It was a mental battlefield. And right now, Carlos was fighting an uphill battle in his own head. Every time he tried to brush it off, telling himself that this was just a temporary blip in his career, the doubts came roaring back. What if this isn't just Sinner's moment? What if this is the beginning of a new era? What if I'm no longer the rising star everyone believes in? The barista interrupted his spiral, appearing at his table with a hesitant smile. "Need a refill?" she asked softly, her voice breaking through the fog in his mind. Carlos blinked, realizing how lost in thought he must have looked. "No, I'm good," he replied, forcing a faint smile. She nodded and left him alone again, and as she walked away, he sank back into his seat, the weight of his thoughts pressing down harder than ever. As the night dragged on, something in Carlos began to shift. The anger that had been burning inside him slowly gave way to something else, reflection. The bitterness softened into a quieter determination. He started to understand that his feelings toward Sinner weren't just about rivalry or jealousy. Beneath all of it was fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of failing to live up to the sky-high expectations he'd set for himself. Fear of losing the identity he'd worked so damn hard to build. But as much as he hated admitting it, that fear was also a wake-up call. Sinner's victory wasn't just a reminder of how quickly things could change in tennis. It was a reminder of how little control he had over the stories being written around him. There would always be another champion. Another Cinderella story. Another headline-stealing moment. The only thing Carlos could control was his own response. He leaned back in his chair, staring into his empty coffee cup as if it held the answers he was searching for. The truth was, it didn't matter what the media said, or what the fans thought, or even how much Sinner seemed to be soaking up the spotlight. What mattered was how he played, how he carried himself, and how he fought to reclaim that spotlight. Not with words or insecurities, but with his racket. Carlos knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The rivalry with Sinner would only grow fiercer, the pressure only heavier. But if there was one thing he'd learned in his journey to the top, it was that the only way to silence the noise was to make sure his actions spoke louder than anything anyone else could say. As he got up to leave the cafe, a quiet resolve settled over him. Let them talk. Let them cheer for Sinner. Carlos Alcaraz wasn't done yet.